Record. Well, good afternoon and happy Tuesday. Welcome to Patristicast. I am incredibly excited that I can get back to doing these YouTube conversations that I really haven't had any time to do over the academic year. Teaching high school is exhausting. And the last episode I did was right before Christmas with Peter Martins. And I think the day before we met, I had a fever of about 101. So if you go back to watch the video at all, I probably look like I'm stoned out of my gourd. I got like bloodshot eyes and my hair is everywhere. But it's just recovering from the flu. But today, I am very excited to welcome Dr. Samuel Rubenson. Received his Doctor of Theology from Lund University in 1990, where he is also professor, Church and Mission Studies. And he is the president of the Collegium Patristicum Lundense, the patristic center in Scandinavia. I would imagine that covers all the Nordic countries.
Yeah. Since
1993. And also senior professor of Eastern Christian Studies at Sankt Ignatius, also in Sweden. Now, one thing I didn't know about you, but it kind of makes a lot of sense. You were born in Ethiopia.
That's true, yeah.
Which you mentioned, I read in your description, you say it kind of helps to shape how you think about multiculturalism.
Yep, that's true.
Well, today we are going to talk about your work in Egyptian monasticism primarily, and its intersection with classical Greek education, of which you just led a research group, which I think published your findings in 2018. Is that correct? That edited volume?
Yeah, I think it's
2018. So welcome to Patristicast, Dr. Rubenson.
Thank you.
So I thought maybe I would begin with a question, which is really a paraphrase of Tertullian's famous rhetorical question, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? And ask you, based on this essay you wrote in this festschrift in honor of Philip Rousseau, the late Philip Rousseau, what has Pythagoras to do with Antony of Egypt?
Yeah, quite a lot, I would say, because there was a clear revival of Pythagoreanism in the late 3rd and in the 4th century. As we know, Pythagoras was referred to especially by the disciples of Plotinus, and probably also by Plotinus himself, as we think, at least, because we have these lives of Pythagoras that were written by the disciples of Plotinus. And this was probably a reaction to the spread of Christianity, and especially, of course, the conversion of Constantine and the acceptance of Christianity. And Pythagoras was seen as a kind of counter-Christ, I would say, or counter-saint. And I think that especially Athanasius, who was, of course, engaged in this debate, especially under Julian, who was also you could say, an adherent of Pythagoras, it became important to show for Athanasius that Antony eclipsed Pythagoras. So I think the lives of Pythagoras, as was shown already by Richard Reitzenstein more than 100 years ago, the life of Antony refers back to the lives of Pythagoras, and Antony is the counter saint to Pythagoras. So they have a lot to do with one another in that kind of literary fight.
Right, that was quite striking how you put the section, I believe it was Porphyry's Life of Pythagoras, not Yamna, yes, right next to Athanasius's Life of Antony. And the passage was almost verbatim in Athanasius's Life of Antony. Now, modern readers, people watching this who might not have any background in ancient philosophy or Christian monasticism or even Christian theology in general, might be wondering, Pythagoras, this is the guy that taught us how to find the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but he also started a pretty sophisticated and long-lasting philosophical tradition. And you're kind of suggesting here that Athanasius's Life of Antony was a competitor to at least how Pythagorean philosophy was received. And it brings you to this, your much larger point that these monks in Egypt, and Antony in particular, but the monks in Egypt were not just a bunch of rustic, illiterate rubes, which is kind of the general portrayal of them. Is that correct?
Yeah, there has been this kind of portrayal, which I think has had its background. Both Protestant scholars have tried to denigrate monasticism in general, these people who went into the desert blinded by a kind of biblical fundamentalism and trying to fight demons. Mm-hmm. And also Catholic scholars have had the idea that to show that this came, that Antony was taught only by God and had nothing to do with the classical culture. And this fits the kind of idea that Christianity brought something completely new and changed the world. Mm-hmm. And also classical scholars have tended to think that way, that the old tradition was destroyed by the Christians. Mm-hmm. So all these ideas have, of course, combined, resulted in this view of monasticism as something anti-cultural, anti-Greek, anti-philosophical, and so on. Yes, but when you look more closely at it, you see that such a movement like monasticism does not appear out of nothing, out of the blue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, that still exists today, that portrait of these monks as being illiterate and anti-intellectual in a way. Your book here on the letters of St. Antony, monasticism and the making of a saint, you do a pretty close analysis of the extant letters of Antony, and you come away seeing Antony being perhaps maybe not as highly philosophically educated as maybe someone like Origen, but still steeped in that tradition.
Yeah.
And so know thyself becomes a pretty key theme in Antony's letters. Could you speak a little bit more about that? That's quite interesting.
I was surprised myself because I had read this, that Antony was illiterate and a rustic monk and had no connection. This was the only thing I knew. And then when in Egypt, I went to Coptic monasteries, I found a book in Arabic, the letters of St. Antony. And I thought, this is very odd. How could there be letters by an illiterate monk? And since I was trying to learn Arabic, I thought this is a good little booklet to start learning Arabic. So I actually bought it in the monastery of St. Macarius, and reading the letters, I was surprised. And then I tried to find out what background is there for these letters. And then I looked into research and found that, yes, the letters were known. They were known in Syriac and Georgian and in Latin, and partly there were Coptic fragments of them. And then I tried to figure out, are these really authentic? And this became a struggle against this opinion of most scholars that thought these letters were not really, they could not have been written, but all manuscripts refer to Antony. And moreover, Jerome, who wrote only a few decades later, refers to the letters of Antony. And then also reading the life of Antony, it's clear that Antony actually promoted writing down one's thoughts, and he had a correspondence, according to the life of Antony, with the emperors. So I started to think maybe there is more to this than just fake letters. And then I started to read them more thoroughly and found that they belong to an Origenist tradition, and that they must belong to the early 4th century, the references to Arius and so on. So they must have been written by somebody called Antony in the beginning of the 4th century. And then looking more closely at the arguments for them being not authentic, I found that all these arguments depended on presuppositions. And if you get rid of these presuppositions, actually the letters fit very well with what we know about Antony from other sources.
What you are describing is the process of doing theology historically. Knowing, you know certain things about Antony already, but you closely scrutinize these texts in light of that knowledge, but also raise new questions to learn a little bit more about that history, which is quite fascinating. You don't just read it for its philosophical wisdom, but you read it for what we can actually tell about Antony, and it kind of guides your conclusions that you make. That seems to have really revolutionized how we understand early Egyptian monasticism. I like to contrast your work a little bit with Douglas Burton Christie, who, it's a good book. His book, was it The Word in the Desert?
Yeah.
But he does seem, I think, to focus a little bit too much on orality and anti-intellectual spirituality, missing some of the points that you bring out.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've realized, perhaps through my background in Ethiopia and so on, that Christianity is an ongoing process where people contribute more or less all the time. I always react when people say that early Christianity was influenced by Platonism or influenced by this or that, because everybody becoming a Christian, of course, contributes with their own circumstances and their own context. And so if philosophers like Origen became Christians, they of course brought their way of reasoning into, and like everybody else, if peasants became Christians, that also had an impact. So Christianity as a historical process was very important to me, and I actually learned very much from Robert Wilkins' book, The Myth of Christian Beginnings, about this, looking historically at the process of making Christianity. And so I could, in contrast to for instance, Burton Christie, I couldn't just read the text and say, this is theology because Christianity looks like this, but rather trying to find out, why do they write this way? What kind of concepts are they using? What is their background? Where did they learn how to read and write? What text did they read? And going back to that, I could of course see that in the letters of St. Antony, he must have known exegetical works that have their origin with Origen, that come from that tradition, because he refers to exactly the same biblical verses and interprets them in the same way and so on. So trying to figure out his background, I realized that he must have had quite a schooling in biblical exegesis and in contemporary philosophy of the time. And it's interesting to see that Athanasius does not write about that because he has another purpose, but he writes about 20 years in seclusion. And now, of course, these 20 years fit exactly what is said about Pythagoras learning. So I think there is a kind of idea here that you don't speak about his schooling, but he had, of course. That's clear from the letters.
And so there's a shared culture that's taking place with its own, unique variations, but certainly a broader cultural underpinning. They're using similar motifs in their literature. Reading your work on Antony and Egypt, thinking about my own work on Origen. Origen, of course, had a school in Caesarea Maritima. How many students he had, don't really know, but he had a patron. And he writes in a letter, if I remember right, I think it's to Pope Fabian. And he's talking about his patron, Ambrose. And he's complaining that Ambrose keeps coming up to him with these propositions, these philosophical propositions that he wants Origen to answer. And it takes time away from meals and textual studies, he says, and going for walks, he says in this letter. And I start to think about Cassian's conferences. You know, the conferences are Cassian and Germanus, a friend, who approach different abbas, and they bring to them questions that they want these abbas to answer for them. And the back and forth between Cassian and mostly Germanus and the abbas does seem to be a little bit like a philosophical academy in a certain way. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, but I just find that similarity so striking.
Actually, before I started to work on the life of Antony and the letters of Antony, I had encountered the apophthegmata patrum, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and I wrote a small booklet on them before I did my dissertation. It was actually an outcome of my master's thesis. And exactly this was, I tried first to work on them like a systematic theologian. What do they say about Christology, anthropology, and so on? And it didn't work because they are, you can't really fit them into the categories of modern systematic theology. But then I realized that they consist of these questions and answers. Yes. I started instead to write about what are the questions and what are the main questions, and found out that they are about gaining peace, how to live a life that is a good life, how to find what is right, how to prepare for death, and the answers are then coming out of that. And I realized that this looks very much like Plato, and so it's this kind of teaching a way of life that prepares you for death. And so there I already started on this idea of there being a connection with ancient philosophy, because ancient philosophy was not a theoretical subject. It was a subject of how to live. Yeah.
And how to live, and debating that, reading texts and discussing texts, as Plotinus accused the Gnostics of, you know, they misread their ancestors, presumably Plato, and manipulated them. They didn't read them correctly, and Plotinus was giving his audience the proper reading in Platonic philosophy. But even him doing his philosophy in a house where he had students, and presumably his patroness, I think it was a woman that was kind of funding his project. Questions and answers, how to live a good life. But it's always taking place, it seems to me, within the reading of literature. And you say for Antony, that's the Bible, but it's not reading the Bible like a modern biblical critic would. It's reading the Bible, allowing it to inform your idea of a good life, what it is to live a good life.
Yeah, because the Bible for them, like other, you could say, earlier literature, Greek literature, was not a book telling you facts about the past, because that was not what they were concerned about, but actually giving a way of thinking, meditating on verses, so that you actually put them before your eyes and you repeated them in order for these texts to form your life. You could say to interpret your life. As you said in the beginning, knowing oneself was very important in the letters of Antony. And it was, of course, part of the entire philosophical school tradition, that you put yourself in front of the text in order to make the text a mirror in which you could understand yourself, what it is to be a human, and how you become a good human being, how you model your life. So their interest in the text were as models, as inspiration, and texts about Noah and Abraham and prophets and so on were read as if they were texts about the reader.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting as we're having this discussion right now, I'm trying to translate the fragments of Origen's commentary and Lamentations, which is one of his earliest biblical commentaries. And he does this with the Babylonian exile and Jeremiah lamenting, and he talks about, he situates it within its historical context. He does. Jeremiah is lamenting that Jerusalem has been emptied and is now held captive, but that's not where he ends. He applies that to the rational soul, and how the rational soul in some way or how Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile is a model for understanding how the soul, the rational soul, is in some respects held captive by the demons and demonic forces when it doesn't apply right reason, when it doesn't use its rational mind to make good judgments about how to live.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great example of what you're talking about with Antony, and using the text as a model, a framework for living one's own life. They're not debating historical context as much as they are engaged in learning how to comport their lives to the biblical witness, I guess.
Yeah.
So what does that suggest to you about the nature of monastic education in Egypt? What do you think is going on in their educational programs?
I think what was going on, and we have found some evidence for that is reported in the book you mentioned on monastic education, and actually described by both Jerome and Basil of Caesarea, that when you were, as in the classical schools, when you were learning how to read and write, you used models from literature, and you repeated the alphabet and so on in that context, using that models and those names and so on, and then you put them into sentences, and then you take sentences from Menander and others, and you model your way of thinking on these, and you rewrite them. And that's what we can see going on also in the apothegmata tradition. So I think that when looking more closely at the concepts that were used in classical education, the importance of ascesis, of gymnasis, of melete, these concepts, you find them in all the monastic texts. The importance of training, of rehearsal, of retreat from daily life, of silence, of repetition, all these things that we know from the schools, both rhetorical and philosophical schools, we find in the monastic material. So what I sometimes say, they did the same as in the classical schools, but they exchanged Homeros and Homer for the Bible. So they used the models and the purpose, but they took other texts, namely the biblical texts, as their basis.
And were they producing or transmitting texts as well? There seems to be a lot of evidence now, material evidence, that these monks were not allergic to material books. I mean, Pythagoras was a copyist and an excellent biblical scholar in his own right, but there also seems to be a great deal of literary production in the desert.
Yeah, when we look at the archaeological evidence, and of course, the 1st century has left very little of archaeological evidence, but when we get into the 5th century, the 400s, the things that we have found give evidence of a certain wealth, a lot of connection with the cities, the set up with a master and disciples, like a teacher. Exactly what Iamblichus describes about Pythagoras is what we find in the archaeological evidence. But we also find on the walls, where some frescoes are preserved, both paintings of teachers and quotations from both biblical text and from sayings. And then, of course, a little later, we also find papyri with actually not only biblical texts, but also Menander and other classical writers. So it's clear that this is a kind of school context.
Well, certainly with respect to the papyri, there's the Tura papyri where we found some fragments of Origen, but almost more importantly, Didymus the Blind, who was, very famous teacher in Alexandria, Egypt. And is it Rufinus who reported, or Jerome, I can't remember, that Antony had visited the school of Didymus? Is that correct? I can't remember.
Yeah,
right off the top
actually, this is a story that is recounted both in Jerome and Rufinus with some differences. So it's clear they haven't not copied it from one another. They must have had it from another source. And both of them were, of course, at the end of the 4th century. So they were with a source that was fairly close to Didymus. And we know that Rufinus studied with Didymus. So it's a very clear historical connection. And we have this mention that Didymus had a cell in the desert.
Yes, that's correct.
He traveled between Alexandria and the desert, which was not that far away.
Yeah, geographically would have been pretty close, except, let's see. I just got a message. This is going to end in 10 minutes. Okay. So, where was I? Didymus.
Didymus, yeah.
So I'm going to have Lincoln Blumel on here next week, who's done a lot of really good work on the Tura papyri, especially the lectures on the Psalms. And what you see, you actually see student questions in there where you get a prompt, well, a little abbreviation question, and you see a student asking a question, and a lot of them are philosophical in nature. In Jesus's agony in Gethsemane, they're asking about, well, what is a passion? And did Jesus have passions? So there does seem to be a degree of philosophical erudition and concern. These are the questions that arose as they were reading the Bible, which is just fascinating. I think it opens up whole new pathways for us to understand what's going on in the Egyptian desert.
One also has to realize that an important part of this monastic philosophical life was prayer. And of course, Evagrius writes a lot about it, and Origen too. And in prayer, you start with words, but you don't invent your own words. You don't just say what you think, but you use biblical text as your prayers, and especially of the Psalms. And thus we get this very strong emphasis on trying to use the Psalms and trying to interpret them and teach on the basis of the Psalms that we know both Evagrius and Origen and others did. So there is a connection here between learning and prayer that's very important.
Well, and this also brings us back to this notion, this multiculturalism, because Cassian in Conference 14, he complains that as he's praying the Psalms, his mind keeps getting distracted with memories of classical poetry that he read. Oh. So, he asked the Alba, and I can't remember which one it is at the time, what do I do about this? And he says, just pray more and more and more. And the more you do it, the Psalm will become your prayer, and you'll find yourself less distracted. Prayer, Conference 10, John Cassian. This is where Theophilus, Bishop of Alexandria, supposedly writes this festal letter to the monks in Egypt, telling them not only when Easter is going to be, but also that they can't pray with any kind of mental images of God depicting him in human form. And you have poor Serapion say, wretch that I am, they've taken my God away from me. You doubt the historicity of that account, but the philosophical concept of prayer is still very important. You recognize it's very important here in the Origenist controversy.
Yeah, I think that, of course, Cassian uses what happened in Egypt for a specific purpose when he's writing to a very different audience. But it's clear that Theophilus had this background, and of course he was he was in a situation where there was this pagan revival, where the images became very important. And so I think it's not difficult to understand his festal letter, and which is in line with much of the monastic teaching. But then what Cassian wants to, of course, do is to teach less educated monks, and especially monks he encounters in France, a lesson. So he makes this image of this Serapion, which I don't think represents very much of Egyptian monasticism. But of course, there was also differences in the monastic schools in Egypt, exactly how to understand biblical language about God's hand and God's face and so on. So of course, in that context, the issue of a kind of anthropocentric image of God was an issue.
And whether Cassian's depiction of his account is accurate, what his concern was the interpretation of Genesis 1:26. God making mankind in his image and likeness. And he accuses Serapion and the anthropomorphites, the people who depicted God in human form, of being philosophically illiterate. They don't know how to understand not just the biblical text, but the nature of God. So again, you have the confluence here of philosophy, metaphysics, prayer, the Bible, and living well, doing things rightly, praying correctly, praying properly. I continue to want to do something with this story, because I just find it so fascinating. But I don't know, it seems like you guys have kind of beat me to it with your work on paideia in the Egyptian desert. It really was, and Cassian is an example of this. He was bilingual, Greek, and he translated the Greek into Latin. You noted how there was in Alexandria and in the desert, there was it was like a melting pot. People from all different cultures were there, bringing their own traditions with them. So I guess we got like 3 minutes left. Do you have any last words, anything you want to wrap up on in terms of?
No, I would, in my last contribution on the origin of the Origenist controversy, I think that what's important to understand is that the image of Origen as with an emphasis on certain teachings of Origen, for which he was later then more or less condemned, has contributed to a misunderstanding of that conflict, because it was not these propositions or suggestions, I would rather say, by Origen that made Origen important, or Origenist tradition important to the monks, because they were using Origen's methods of teaching, his methods of reading the Bible. That was what was most important to them. And this fitted well this search for a Christian philosophical school that much of the monastic experiment was about. And here the conflict became between the emphasis of the bishops on a kind of standard teaching of the church with this more free movement of monastic search for models. So it was more about, is the church to be defined by a specific teaching that could be accepted by all and by councils that would fit the congregations in the city? Or is it a philosophical way of life that was guarded by the monks? And in a way, we have a kind of situation where two different understandings of what Christianity is about that finally found some kind of balance in monasticism on the one hand and parish life on the other. but
which
it took some
continues to
time.
this day to some degree.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Rubenson, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
And stay tuned for the next episode of Patristicast coming next week, where we're going to hop into a related discussion of Didymus the Blind. Till then, take care.
Take care and all the best.